It was a simple joke, born from a moment of camaraderie and the absurdity of life in space. A corned beef sandwich, of all things, wasn't supposed to make it to orbit. But it did, and what started as a harmless act of humor almost turned into a massive crisis for NASA, one that would test the limits of trust, responsibility, and the delicate balance of mission-critical operations. This is the story of how one astronaut, in a split second of defiance, smuggled a sandwich into space, and how that sandwich nearly changed everything. The year was 2008, and the mission was STS-126. The crew of the Space Shuttle Endeavour was preparing for a routine space mission, a resupply flight to the International Space Station. But for the astronauts aboard, there was nothing routine about it. The mission would span 16 days in orbit, a time where every second mattered and every action was weighed in the context of human survival in the vast, unrelenting vacuum of space. Among the astronauts was a man named Glenn. He had always been a bit of a joker, someone who found humor even in the most dangerous and serious situations. He was known for lightening the mood with his dry wit, but also for his keen intellect and sense of responsibility. Glenn had already made his mark on the space program by this point, but the upcoming mission would solidify his reputation for something else entirely. The crew was gearing up for launch in the Kennedy Space Center. The final days before a launch are filled with procedures, briefings, and endless checks. The astronauts go through rigorous training simulations and make sure all their gear is in top condition. But in between the work, there was also time for a little relaxation. It was during one of these down moments that the conversation began. "Hey, what do you think it would be like if we could take a little piece of Earth with us?" Glenn asked, his eyes twinkling. The other astronauts chuckled. They were used to Glenn's offbeat humor, but this time the idea began to take root. What if they really could take something from Earth, something small and completely out of place, into space? It was absurd, but as the joke grew, so did the question. What could they bring? The answer, strangely enough, was corned beef. For reasons unknown to anyone, the image of a corned beef sandwich became the crew's go-to idea. Maybe it was the simplicity of it. Maybe it was just because the idea was so absurd. Whatever it was, the more they joked about it, the more it became a reality. The plan was simple. Glenn would sneak a corned beef sandwich on board. Just a small one tucked away in his lunch bag, nothing too obvious. After all, the food in space was notoriously unappetizing. A sandwich, with its soft bread and flavorful filling, would be a welcome change. And so, the plan was set in motion. As the crew boarded the shuttle for the final countdown, no one was any wiser. The sandwich sat hidden in the folds of Glenn's suit, packed away as carefully as any other piece of astronaut equipment. It was a ridiculous idea, but in that moment, the astronauts felt like they were in on a secret that only they would ever understand. As the shuttle rose into the sky, there was an unspoken agreement. This was just a joke. Something to make them smile in the sterile, regimented environment of space. A moment of lightness in the face of the weight of their mission. In the weightlessness of space, things took on a new life. The rules of gravity no longer applied, and with them, many of the normal constraints of reality. The sandwich, now in orbit, floated with a carefree abandon, a tiny symbol of rebellion in a world of exact science and precise calculations. Glenn and the crew had arrived at the International Space Station, and they had begun their work. They floated through modules, attaching cables, checking equipment, performing experiments. But in the quiet moments when the crew was alone, the sandwich came up. The crew had to act quickly. This was not a time for distractions. But there was something about it. They couldn't resist. Glenn, always the ringleader, decided it was time. He took the sandwich out from its hiding spot and unwrapped it carefully. It was a simple sandwich. No condiments, no frills. Just corned beef nestled between two slices of rye bread. To an astronaut who had spent months eating rehydrated, tasteless meals, this sandwich was the pinnacle of luxury. It was, in many ways, an act of rebellion against the sterile, controlled world of space. He looked around. His fellow astronauts were busy with their tasks. This was the perfect time. He took a bite, and the moment of humor turned into something much more real. The sandwich tasted just as good as he had imagined. The simple pleasure of biting into a familiar piece of food, something from Earth, brought a wave of comfort in the isolation of space. For a brief second, the crew was connected to the world they had left behind. They shared a moment of humanity that had nothing to do with missions or space exploration. But that wasn't the end of it. What Glenn didn't realize, however, was the potential danger this seemingly harmless act had caused. The bread. The corned beef. The crumbs. In the absence of gravity, they floated. They drifted. And in the confined space of the space station, they began to spread. Some landed on the equipment, others floated toward the ventilation system. Soon they were everywhere. Glenn had not thought about the consequences of crumbs in space. It wasn't just a funny, rebellious gesture anymore. It was a potential hazard. NASA had been in charge of keeping the space station clean, and the engineers had designed everything with extreme precision. Loose debris, no matter how small, could damage delicate instruments or worse, clog up critical life support systems. What had begun as a simple prank was now something much more serious. Glenn's heart sank as he realized what was happening. He quickly tried to clean up the mess, but it was too late. The crumbs had already spread. He knew he had to report what had happened before things got worse. It was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, but it was a mistake that could not be ignored. He contacted Mission Control. The tone of the conversation was serious, almost too serious for what seemed like such a trivial matter. "We've got a problem," Glenn began, explaining what had happened. "It's not just the sandwich, it's the crumbs. They're floating around and I'm not sure what damage they might cause." There was a long pause. And then the voice from Mission Control broke through the silence. "This could be a serious issue. We need to bring you home immediately." The crew's laughter faded, replaced by the understanding that this had become more than a joke. There were protocols in place, and every decision, no matter how small, was critical in the vacuum of space. The tiny, defiant act of smuggling a sandwich had now escalated into a full-blown crisis. The next few hours were tense. The astronauts scrambled to secure the loose crumbs, floating them into specially designed containers. Every small particle of debris had to be accounted for. As they worked, they couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. A corned beef sandwich, an innocent, delicious piece of Earth, had nearly compromised the entire mission. As the mission neared its end, there was a lingering feeling of unease. What had started as a moment of lightness in space had quickly turned into a lesson in responsibility. The crew had learned something important, not just about the technical aspects of space but about themselves. Space was a place where every action had consequences, and even the smallest of decisions could ripple out into something much larger. Back on Earth, the story of the sandwich would become one of NASA's most notorious anecdotes. It would be passed around in hushed conversations in mission debriefings, laughed about at astronaut reunions, and even joked about in interviews. But for Glenn and the crew, the sandwich was more than just a funny story. It was a reminder that in the vast, uncharted unknown of space, there was no room for error, no matter how small. In the end, it was a lesson about the gravity of space, the real weight of responsibility that comes with being an astronaut. And for Glenn, it was a lesson in humility. The sandwich had nearly ruined everything. Yet in the end it didn't. He had faced the crisis, owned up to his mistake, and ensured that the mission would continue without incident. What started as a joke had turned into a profound learning experience, and it left everyone with one simple truth: even the smallest things, the most seemingly insignificant choices, could have far-reaching consequences in the cold, unforgiving world of space.